Hi, I'm Dr. Jacob Lauritsen, and this is Read, Write, and Cite, a channel where I teach you how to read, write, and cite for your college classes. In this video, we're going to be talking about the story To Build a Fire by Jack London. Now, in a previous video, I did kind of a setup, some of the things you might want to be thinking about before you read it. I am assuming if you're watching this, you've read it. You're not just trying to get out of reading it by watching a video on the internet. I'm going to talk about the story, things that happened, and how they relate to some of the literary devices that London uses in the story, and then how you might use something like this to write a paper. Okay, so let's talk about it. All right, so first of all, the setting is a huge important part of the story in To Build a Fire. In fact, the first paragraph or two, that's all that London is describing. He's describing this place, the Yukon of Alaska. It is cold, it is snowy, and it's not a great place for people to be. Then it starts introducing our character, the man. He's never given a name. He's only ever called the man. It's not even capitalized. It's just the man, lowercase. And it starts describing him, how he's new to this place. He doesn't really understand it, and it kind of describes how naive he is, just how much he doesn't really know. That when he hears 50 degrees below zero, that doesn't mean much to him except that that's really cold. He doesn't understand how cold that is. And it's using that to kind of foreshadow what this character doesn't know, which is going to be really important later on. Introducing kind of what's going to lead to problems later. So this foreshadowing is it's hinting at what's going to come next. Okay, so as he starts out on his journey, we know that he's kind of got this idea in his head. He's got a plan. He hasn't completely avoided thinking through this. He's just been a bit naive about the process. He's planning on making good time. He's going to walk such and such fast. He's going to make it to the camp that he's walking to a little bit after 6. It's going to be after night, but it's not going to be too bad because once he gets there, there's going to be a fire, there's going to be a warm meal, and it's going to be great. The men that he's going to visit with, that he calls the boys, he's going to run into them and everything's going to be okay. As he goes on his journey, though, we slowly start to see things start going badly, right? It starts out well. He's traveling with a dog that's with him. It's a husky. It's native to the area, and the dog knows, wait, this is a really bad time to be traveling. So again, we've introduced earlier that this man's kind of naive. It's his first winter in the Yukon. There's a lot of things he doesn't know. Then we have the dog, and the dog knows these things. The way he's describing the story, the way London is telling the story, we get the perspective of both the man and the dog. If we're talking about point of view, we call that third person omniscient, because you're getting the insights, the thoughts, and the feelings for more than one character. And we get the thoughts and feelings for both of them, even though literally there is no dialogue throughout the entire story. It's just description. So again, setting, this place that the story is happening and what happens there. That the plot, that's everything for this story. Okay, so he starts out on his journey. The dog knows, well, it was probably a stupid idea. And things are going pretty well. He's traveling pretty fast. It says that he's going at about 4 miles an hour, which, I mean, it sounds so compared to a car, but that's like a 15-minute-mile pace. Like walking in the snow with snowshoes, that's super good, I would say. Right? Anyway, so he's traveling, he's making good time. It describes how his lunch is like this biscuit that he's got hidden in his clothes, getting some body heat. It's, it's in there, whatever. It describes how he's chewing tobacco, and it's slowly, like the spittle from his mouth is slowly like forming this crust around his beard on his mouth. It's describing, again, I keep saying describing because it's all about setting. It's describing how his cheeks are cold where there isn't a beard. It's cold, and he keeps rubbing it with these buttons that he has, and he's kind of got this cap on, and he's making pretty good time, but he's paying very close attention to where he's at because he knows Sometimes the ice is misleading, and sometimes the ice is not as thick as it appears. And underneath, it could be just a couple inches down, it could be a couple feet down. There might be a warm spring where there's water that's not frozen. And if he breaks through, that could be really dangerous. Bum, bum, bum. That's foreshadowing, right? Telling you something that's gonna maybe happen later. Okay, so he's doing pretty well. He stops for lunch. Things are okay. He's like, oh, I've got to stop and build a fire. So we see him go through this process of building a fire. He's not super experienced at it, but he does okay. He's able to kind of warm up all the frozen bits on his face so that it's not, I don't know, so he can actually feed himself, And we see this process of what it's like to build a fire, because that's going to be important later. And we know, again, that's the title of the story. As he continues to travel, he runs into a problem. He breaks through the ice, and he goes up to I can't get my foot up high enough, up to his knees. And it's bad. Like he didn't go fully submerged, but from knees down, he is wet. And it is very, very cold. The narrator tells us it's more than 50 degrees below zero. It's like 75 below zero. And now, like a third of him is wet. And he knows he has to stop and he builds a fire. Well, he knows how to do that. He's already done it that day. So he goes and he gathers things, but he's trying to do it fast. So he gets things that are close by. He builds a fire. He gets it going and everything's okay. But he didn't pick a good spot. He does it right underneath this tree. And, well, that's bad news because there's snow everywhere. There's snow on the branches. And after he gets the fire going, the snow falls off the tree and snuffs out the fire. So let's talk about irony. Irony is one of those literary devices that an author uses to kind of, things are happening contrary to what you might expect. It's kind of opposite. He builds a fire to get warm, but what happens? Ironically, it gets snuffed out. Well, what's he supposed to do? Well, because we're in his head and we already know these thoughts that he's thinking, he's already said, well, you have to do it on the first time if you're walking by yourself out in the middle of nowhere. He didn't get it on his first try, so he goes to do it again. But now he's starting to get really cold. He's losing feeling. His fingers can't do much, and so when he gets the matches out, he has to take it with his mouth to pull out the match, and he finally gets it to strike the match against his pants, and he's got a fire right next to his face, and the smoke goes up his nose. He coughs. He drops the match, and the match goes out. It's like, oh no, this isn't going to work. So he's getting frantic. He throws off his gloves. He takes the matches. He lights all of them at once. It says there's like 70 matches, and he's trying to light this fire, and he realizes his hands are burning. They're so numb he can't really feel it, but he's on fire. But he has to ignore it because what's more important, losing your fingers or dying in the middle of nowhere. So he continues. He gets a little bit of a fire going, but he's still under this tree. Like he gets this moss like falls on it. He tries to get the moss off, so that's not a problem, and then he knocks over the fire and it goes out. He's out of matches, and he's got a problem. The first thing he does is he starts looking around and he sees the dog. And he remembers this story of like, well, maybe you could cut open the dog and he can hide inside and he can survive. And when he starts calling the dog over, the dog's like, nah, I'm not doing that. I don't know what you're doing, but you seem different right now and I don't trust you. Which again, it's showing this theme of man versus nature. Man is just completely failing in nature at this moment, and the dog knows better. And the dog doesn't trust him. The dog only sticks around him because the man makes fire, and the dog wants to be warm. So finally he chases down the dog. He doesn't have function in his hands. He finally grabs the dog, and he realizes he can't do anything. So he lets the dog go. The dog runs away. He's like, what's wrong with you, man? And so the guy's frantic. He gets up and he starts to run, but he doesn't have the endurance, and he just starts falling. He's like, okay, I'm not going to run. I'm going to walk. He tries to walk, but he's just like, he begins to realize this isn't going to work out for him. And so instead of, he starts to feel like embarrassed with how he's reacting. The guy's dying, but he's embarrassed how he's reacting. He's like, you know what? I'm going to go out with dignity. He just kind of sits down and he starts to get drowsy. And he starts to imagine the men the next day finding him being okay, him having this conversation with the man that warned him not to do this. That they call and then he's gone. And the dog is watching him, waiting for the fire. And he never makes it. And when the dog gets a little bit closer, realizes, oh, this guy's dead. And the dog has no reason to stick around now. Because he only stuck around. The man didn't treat him well. He only sticks around for fire. The man can't do that for him, so he starts to trot off to the camp where he knows there will be men there that can make a fire. And that's the story. It's kind of harsh, right? But it's realistic. It's this style in literature we call naturalism or realism. It's this kind of hyper-real situation. It's not fantasy. It's not even based on the drama, but it's about the setting and this man and this dog inside this setting and his stubbornness, his naivete, his ignorance to what he should do and not listening to good advice causes him to be in a bad situation that he can't save himself from. That's a real downer of a story, right? But it's a really classic story that hits on all these literary elements we've been talking about the whole time really, really well. So what do you do with this? Well, let's say you're going to write a paper. You could easily write a paper about how the setting is an important character, if you will. You talk about man versus the wild, man versus nature. The setting wins, right? The setting is not beat by man. As much as the man thinks he's got things figured out, he doesn't. You could talk about that. What would you do in the paper? Well, you come up with some for the thesis. Again, it had to be debatable. You'd have to be able to argue it. And you just explain that, a thesis like this, for example, in Jack London's To Build a Fire, the man, tries to compete against nature and loses because of his stubbornness, his ignorance, his naivete, or whatever. And then you explain it. And that might be one based on character, about the flaws in his character traits. And then you just use examples from throughout the stories, the examples of what he remembers and what he ignored, what he does and what he does poorly. That could be the root of a paper. You could talk about foreshadowing, how things happen early on that kind of warn you what's going to happen later. He introduces building the fire. He's thinking, you got to do this right. Then later he builds a fire and it doesn't go well. We know what the correct way to building the fire does, and when he has to do it later when he's under duress, it doesn't work out. So there's a little bit of foreshadowing there. There's some irony in that, the man thinks he's doing everything right, and then just nature wins. It's just going to snuff out the fire, and there's nothing he can do about it. You could talk about fate, fatalism, or something like that, that there's nothing that the man could do to overcome the situation. It's fate that he's going to die. There's a lot of different ways to take a paper, and that's the point. You could take a story like this, focus in on these literary elements, these literary devices that London uses to tell a story, theme, character, setting, plot, man versus nature, fatalism, determinism, whatever, all these different big ideas. How would you write a paper on it? You focus on one, use examples from the story, you try to argue something that's debatable, and you just make your case. That's the root of a literary analysis paper. So this was a super fast discussion. I hope that if you are in a college class that you can have a longer, more thorough discussion than this. I just wanted to get this out there for some of my students and for anyone out there who'd benefit from just kind of hearing some thoughts for what you might think about when reading discussing the story and maybe some ideas on how to turn something like this into a paper. So I hope that this was helpful. I'm Dr. Jacob Larson. This has been Read, Write, and Cite, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.